We are joined by study co-author and McGill Assistant Professor, Dr. Alissa Koski. Thank you for your time today, Doctor.
Thank you for inviting me, Nima.
So let's start with this. Why are child marriages occurring legally in Canada?
Well, let me start by saying that the United Nations defines child marriage as any marriage before the age of 18. But current Canadian law permits 16 and 17-year-olds to legally marry if their parents consent.
And how do these findings speak towards Canada as a first world country and global leader in human rights? We mentioned that we're part of a UN effort to eradicate child marriages globally. So how does this speak towards our efforts?
It's an interesting question. Canada has worked very hard to place itself at the forefront of global efforts to end child marriage. The country addresses this issue by providing millions of dollars in foreign aid to try to curb child marriages elsewhere in the world. And we've sponsored United Nations resolutions on this issue. The fact that child marriage remains legal across the country would seem to undermine our credibility in those efforts on the international stage.
And I really want to get into the demographics of this study. Would you be able to highlight the ages, the cultures, and the genders of the children affected, and as well as the older spouses?
Well, I can answer some of those questions. Child marriage, as you mentioned in the intro, is overwhelmingly female across the globe, and that holds true in Canada as well. In every province and territory, more than 85% of those marriage certificates were issued to young girls. The majority of them, between 2000 and 2018, were 16 or 17 years old, but we did find some as young as 14. That was early in the 2000s, before Canadian marriage law changed to prohibit those marriages. You also asked about how old their spouses were. So I can say that one thing I'm often asked when I discuss my research is whether or not these are sweetheart marriages. For example, a 17-year-old who falls in love with their 18-year-old partner and wants to get married. That type of situation would count as a child marriage. But it doesn't really hold water for a lot of Canadian marriages. When we looked at those marriage certificates, we found that in over 30% of cases, these were girls under the age of 18 who were marrying men at least 5 years older than they were. And in the more extreme cases, 20 years or even more than 30 years older than they were. So these are very age discrepant unions. I can't speak to the ethnicity of the children who are getting married. Marriage certificates don't record that information.
Now, you mentioned in the study that child marriage is defined as formal or informal in Canada. So what does informal marriage mean, and how does it compare to formal child marriages?
Formal child marriages are what most Canadians think of when they think of marriage. You apply for a marriage license, you have a ceremony, you get a marriage certificate, and so your marriage is formal in the eyes of the government. But common law marriages are becoming more and more common in Canada. Those are situations in which a couple is living together for at least a year, but hasn't perhaps gone through a formal ceremony and doesn't have a marriage certificate. Those also count as child marriages and account for an increasing proportion of all the child marriages that we're seeing across the country. They count as child marriages because girls in those situations are likely to experience many of the same harms, whether or not there's a marriage certificate.
And how do these child unions affect the mental health and development of the children affected, ma'am? We've got about 40 seconds left.
Okay. I would say that they're very harmful for a number of health outcomes. Mental health is certainly one, but what we see across the globe is that girls who get married before the age of 18 are more likely to start having children themselves at an early age, which hinders their education, hinders their ability to get training for jobs later in life. They're also more likely to experience domestic violence. So there's a range of poor health outcomes associated with this practice, and that's why it's considered a violation of human rights.
All right, Dr. Koski, thank you for sharing this important information with us today. Thank you.
Thanks, Nima.